The day alien cadets witnessed Earth's war footage and half of them abandoned their posts. Let me be clear, I never wanted to be here. Mandatory interspecies military history is about as appealing as a toxic waste buffet, and I'm Krell Voxnar, third-generation diplomatic corps trainee from the Meridian Clusters. My tentacles were meant for negotiation, not watching ancient war footage from some backwater planet called Earth. The lecture hall buzzed with the usual pre-class chaos. 37 different species crammed into stadium-style seating designed by some sadistic architect who clearly hated comfort. To my left, a Chlorian delegation, all 7 of them were busy photosynthesizing and looking supremely bored. To my right, a cluster of silicon-based Rigelians clicked and whirred, their crystalline structures reflecting the harsh institutional lighting. Professor Lumen, a tentacled administrator from the aquatic governance realm, slithered to the central projection platform. Cadets, she announced, her translation matrix rendering her words in that perfectly modulated bureaucratic tone. Today we examine a critical case study in primitive technological advancement and military strategy. I suppressed a groan. We'd heard this lecture series was notorious a comprehensive breakdown of how various species developed their initial interstellar combat capabilities. Most were predictably boring, mathematically precise Zaloxian expansion protocols, the methodical colonization strategies of the hive collectives. But Earth was different. Rumor had it their historical records were unpredictable. Humanity, Professor Lumen continued, represents an anomalous data point in galactic development. Unlike most species that achieve technological stability through collaborative research, humans seemingly progress through constant conflict, technological improvisation, and what can only be described as spectacular acts of collective insanity. A ripple of nervous laughter swept through the classroom. Every cadet had heard the whispers. Humans were the galaxy's wild card, too erratic to be truly threatening, yet somehow always landing on their feet. They'd gone from riding wooden ships to nuclear capabilities in less than 3 centuries. Most species took millennia to achieve similar technological leaps. My study group, a mixed collection of young diplomats and military strategists, exchanged knowing glances. Zara, a crystalline Rigelian with sharp computational skills, ran some quick probability calculations on her neural interface. Statistical probability of rational decision-making, approximately 12.6%, she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Quiet, I whispered back. The screening is about to start. The main holographic display flickered to life. Primitive 2-dimensional imagery began to resolve grainy, archaic recordings that looked like they'd been captured by machines barely more sophisticated than agricultural sensors. Little did I know that these seemingly innocuous images would transform everything we thought we understood about warfare, strategy, and the very nature of intelligent species. Professor Lumen's final words before the documentary began would echo in my mind for cycles to come. Prepare yourselves. Humanity is not a species to be underestimated. If only we had truly understood what that meant. The classroom settled into an uncomfortable silence, punctuated by the various biological mechanisms of 37 different species, trying not to look nervous. Each of us had our own way of processing impending information. Dex Romar, my Centaurian bunkmate, started clicking his exoskeleton nervously. He'd been betting credits that humans were just another forgettable species, the kind that would burn out before achieving anything remarkable. Bet they're just another failed evolutionary experiment, he muttered, mandibles twitching. 10 credits says you're wrong, Zara interjected, her crystalline form catching the light. She'd already compiled 17 different historical databases about Earth, and her computational matrix suggested humans were statistically improbable. To my left, a nebular named Quinn was doing what nebulars do best, existing in a state of quantum uncertainty. Half of his gaseous form looked bored, while the other half seemed inexplicably excited. It was honestly giving me a headache. Old instructor Lumen's projection changed, and a holographic timeline materialized. Primitive timelines of human conflict began to unspool, remarkable for their apparent chaos and seemingly random progression. Observe, Lumen's translation matrix intoned, the species' developmental trajectory. The first images were almost comical. Humans in metal containers called tanks, hurling explosives at each other with what appeared to be complete disregard for personal safety. Dex let out a low whistle. They're basically walking meat shields with explosives. Zara's computational matrix disagreed. Inefficient. Mathematically unsound. And yet, her voice trailed off. A rare moment of uncertainty for a Regellian. The documentary's first act began with World War II, a term that immediately suggested these humans had made conflict into a numerical franchise. Initial footage was a nightmare of organized chaos. Humans driving metal machines across impossible terrains, developing technologies at rates that defied logical progression. They'd invented radar, jet engines, and advanced communication systems, all while simultaneously trying to obliterate each other. They're developing advanced technologies during active combat? Quinn's gaseous form condensed in pure disbelief. That's not just inefficient. That's criminally wasteful. But we were wrong. So spectacularly wrong. The first shocking moment came with footage of the Manhattan Project. Here were scientists, supposedly rational beings, who decided to harness the fundamental forces of the universe as a weapon. Not because they needed to, but because they could. Dex's mandibles stopped clicking. Zara's computational matrix began to overheat. Quinn's quantum state collapsed into pure, unadulterated shock. A human scientist looking remarkably calm described splitting the atom as casually as one might discuss preparing a meal. We figured out how to release the energy-binding atomic nuclei, the scientist said, and thought, hey, this might be useful. Might be useful. Those 3 words would haunt every single being in that classroom for the rest of their lives. The humans hadn't just developed a weapon. They'd essentially looked at the fundamental building blocks of reality and said, yeah, we can weaponize that. And the truly terrifying part? They were just getting started. Just when we thought we'd seen the worst, the documentary dove deeper. Vietnam. A conflict that defied every single military strategy textbook in the Galactic Academy's extensive archives. They're fighting in a jungle? Dex sputtered, his exoskeleton clicking in pure disbelief. Who fights a war in vegetation so dense you can't see your opponent? Humans, apparently. And not only did they fight, but they also developed entire strategies around the most impossible terrain imaginable. Guerrilla warfare became an art form that made our most advanced military simulations look like children's puzzle games. Zara's computational matrix was working overtime. Her crystalline form actually started to steam, a sure sign of extreme data processing. Probability models suggest a 0.03% chance of survival under these conditions, she muttered. And yet they persist. The footage showed humans carrying impossible amounts of equipment, navigating terrain that would have killed most species within minutes. They developed communication techniques, improvised medical treatments, and maintained unit cohesion under conditions that would have completely fractured any other civilization. Quinn's gaseous form had condensed into something that looked suspiciously like a sweat droplet. They're using music as a psychological warfare tool? He stammered, watching footage of helicopters blasting rock music during combat operations. I couldn't help but laugh. It was either that or cry. These humans weren't just fighting a war, they were turning it into some bizarre performance art. Then came the space race. Oh, sweet galactic bureaucracy, the space race. 2 superpowers decided that the best way to prove technological superiority was to launch themselves into the literal void of space. Not for exploration. Not for scientific discovery. But as the most elaborate flex in the history of any known civilization. They went to the moon? Zara calculated, primarily to prove a point to each other. The footage of the Apollo missions was nothing short of madness. Humans took what was essentially a fancy metal tube, filled it with the most rudimentary computing power imaginable, less processing power than a modern child's learning tablet, and decided to land on another celestial body. Dex's mandibles were clicking so fast now they were practically a blur. They did this with computers less powerful than my breakfast calculator? The truly horrifying part was how casually they approached it. Astronauts told jokes. made quips, treated what should have been a civilization-defining moment like they were taking a casual drive to the local nutrition center. "Houston, the Eagle has landed," one human said, as if he'd just parallel parked a ground vehicle. Quinn's quantum state was in complete meltdown. They're joking? They're joking while potentially dying in the most hostile environment imaginable? "Welcome to humanity," I wanted to tell him, where existential terror is met with a one-liner and a raised eyebrow. The documentary wasn't just showing military history anymore. It was revealing something far more terrifying, a species that didn't just survive against impossible odds, but found those impossible odds amusing. By the time we reached the modern era, half the classroom looked like they were about to request immediate transfer to a different academic track. Decks had stopped clicking entirely. Zara's computational matrix was emitting what could only be described as a whimper. Quinn had condensed into something that looked suspiciously like a panic-induced crystal. And me? I was starting to realize that everything we thought we knew about intelligent species was wrong. Humans weren't just another civilization. They were a force of nature disguised as a species. A walking, talking, joke-cracking embodiment of pure, unbridled potential. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered to Zara. Her response was something I'd never heard from a Rigelian before. Something that sounded remarkably like fear. "Yes," she said, "and I'm not sure I want to see any more." The final segment of the documentary arrived like a quantum shockwave. Modern warfare, technological integration, cybernetic systems, drone technologies, artificial intelligence. But it wasn't the technology that broke us. It was how humans used it. "They're developing AI," Zara said, her crystalline form now completely translucent, a Rigelian sign of complete existential crisis, and immediately start discussing ethical frameworks and potential limitations. Dex leaned forward, mandibles twitching. "They create potentially world-ending technology, and then immediately try to create safeguards against its misuse?" The classroom had transformed. What started as a mandatory historical review had become something else entirely. A revelation. A collective awakening. Footage showed human military units using technologies that seamlessly integrated human intuition with machine precision. But it wasn't just the technology. It was the approach. The understanding that technology was a tool, not a solution. That human creativity, adaptability, and most terrifyingly, their ability to find humor in the most dire circumstances was their true weapon. Quinn's gaseous form had condensed into something that looked like a PhD dissertation on existential shock. They're treating potential apocalyptic scenarios like a problem-solving exercise. I watched as human military strategists discussed complex geopolitical scenarios with a blend of deep analytical thinking and what could only be described as sardonic wit. They weren't just preparing for conflict. They were reimagining the very concept of conflict resolution. The most shocking moment came during a segment about humanitarian efforts. Military units didn't just fight. They rebuilt. They provided medical assistance. They understood that victory wasn't just about defeating an enemy, but about creating sustainable peace. "This makes no sense," Dex muttered. "These are military units. They're supposed to destroy, not build." But humans did both, with equal enthusiasm. 3 cadets from the Xyloxian delegation, known for their rigid, mathematically precise approach to everything, quietly stood up and walked out. Not in anger, not in frustration, but with the look of individuals who had just realized their entire career path was fundamentally wrong. Zara's computational matrix was working overtime. "Recalculating everything," she whispered. "Absolutely everything." The documentary ended. Silence descended. Professor Lumen slithered back to the projection platform, her tentacles moving with what I could only describe as academic smugness. "Questions?" she asked. Chaos erupted. Dex raised his first set of appendages. "Are you telling me this species has been capable of total planetary destruction for decades and yet consistently chooses diplomacy, technological ethics, and humanitarian efforts?" A Chlorian diplomat who had been photosynthesizing quietly in the corner suddenly became very alert. They weaponize humor as a diplomatic tool, he observed. Have you seen their political satire? Quinn's quantum state had completely collapsed into what looked like pure, unadulterated respect. They turn existential horror into comedy, he said. That's not a defense mechanism. That's a superpower. One of the Xyloxian cadets who hadn't left raised a precision-calculated appendage. I'm switching to xenocultural studies, he announced. This is more fascinating than any military strategy. Professor Lumen looked out over the classroom, a mix of shock, horror, and reluctant admiration. Humanity, she said, is not a species to be understood. They are a species to be experienced. As the lecture hall emptied, I caught Zara recalculating something on her neural interface. What are you doing? I asked. She looked up, her crystalline form now a mix of terror and excitement. Updating my entire understanding of intelligent life, she said, and wondering if we could get human comedy streaming services in the Meridian Clusters. We were never going to look at another species the same way again. 3 standard galactic cycles after the documentary, and the Interspecies Military History course had become the most requested elective in the entire Galactic Academy. I found myself sitting in the campus recreation hub, watching the fallout of our collective existential crisis unfold. Zara, now sporting a I Survived Human History 101 commemorative pin, was meticulously tracking the career changes of our former classmates. 17 diplomatic corps candidates have switched to human cultural studies, she reported. Then her crystalline form vibrating with what could only be described as academic excitement. 12 military strategists are now writing speculative fiction about human scenarios. And Dex. As if on cue, Dex Romar stumbled into the recreation hub, wearing what appeared to be a vintage Earth Band t-shirt with something called AC printed on it. His exoskeleton had been modified to play what he claimed was authentic human rock music at the most inappropriate moments. I'm learning guitar, he announced, completely unprompted. A tinny version of Thunderstruck emanated from his modified shell. Quinn's gaseous form condensed into what looked like a disapproving cloud. You've been obsessed with humans for 3 cycles now. Correction, Dex retorted. I've been enlightened. The documentary had become something of a legendary artifact. Copies were traded like rare cultural treasures. The Galactic Historical Archives had to create an entirely new classification system just to catalog the human historical records we'd discovered. Professor Lumen, seemingly the only administrator completely unsurprised by all of this, had been quietly expanding the Human Studies department. Rumors suggested she was personally recruiting experts from Earth, though most administrators thought she was joking. Humans are not a case study, she'd tell anyone who would listen. They're a living, breathing reminder that the universe is far more complex than our carefully constructed models. My own career trajectory had shifted dramatically. What started as a diplomatic course training had become something far more interesting. I was now part of the first official human interaction and cultural comprehension research team. Our primary mission: try to understand a species that could simultaneously develop world-ending technology and use it to share cat videos. The most surprising outcome? The Galactic Diplomatic Corps was now recruiting humans as conflict resolution specialists, not because they were particularly peaceful, but because they seemed to understand conflict better than anyone else. They don't avoid conflict, Zara would explain to bewildered recruitment officers. They transform it. They turn potential destruction into an opportunity for understanding. Dex would inevitably interrupt with another rock music reference. One afternoon, as we compiled our research, a transmission came through from Earth. A human diplomat, responding to our detailed analysis of their historical and cultural complexities. The message was 3 words long, pretty much, yeah? Quinn's quantum state collapsed into pure confusion. Zara's computational matrix ran multiple verification protocols. Dex started playing what he claimed was a victory soundtrack. And me. I laughed. Because after everything we'd learned, that response was perfect. Humans hadn't just changed our understanding of warfare technology or diplomacy. They'd reminded us that intelligence isn't about perfection. It's about adaptation, Creativity. The ability to look at an impossible situation and see not just a challenge, but an opportunity. As the sun set on another day at the Galactic Academy, I realized something profound. We hadn't just studied human history. We'd been given a masterclass in what it means to be truly alive. X's modified exoskeleton started playing Highway to Hell at maximum volume. Some things, I realized, would never change. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.